They say the ocean takes what it wants, but sometimes it gives something back. When a weathered mechanic finds a mysterious woman clinging to driftwood after a violent storm, neither of them realizes how that single moment will change everything. What begins as an act of rescue slowly unfolds into something far deeper, a journey of healing trust and rediscovering the truth buried beneath the waves. Before we dive into this emotional and unforgettable story, if you love heartfelt storytelling filled with hope, compassion, and quiet romance, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us keep sharing stories that touch the soul. Now let's begin. He found her clinging to driftwood after the storm. She was the missing heiress of a ship Tycoon. The wind screamed over the Oregon coastline like a freight train gone wild. Rain lashed sideways, soaking everything in its path, and the sea raged with the fury of something ancient and grieving. To most people, it would have sounded like chaos, but to Jack Whitmore, it was just Thursday night. Inside his weather-beaten boathouse, nestled near the cliffs, Jack crouched beneath the hull of a 40-year-old fishing schooner wrench, in hand, brow furrowed in concentration. The radio had lost signal an hour ago. The power had flickered, coughed, and died not long after. Still, he worked by the glow of a single lantern, its flame trembling in the drafty space. Jack wasn't avoiding the storm. He was used to storms on the water in his past inside his chest. What he avoided was silence. Silence had a way of digging up ghosts. 10 years ago, a storm not so different from this one had swallowed his wife and daughter during what was supposed to be a weekend sailing trip. No bodies were ever recovered, only wreckage and a gaping hole that never quite closed. Since then, Jack had made peace with being alone, or at least convinced himself he had. When the wind picked up even harder, groaning through the rusted beams, Jack finally set the wrench down. He stood knees cracking and grabbed his coat. The generator would need checking. As he stepped outside, the rain punched him in the face, soaking through to his skin within seconds. He muttered a curse and trudged toward the shed near the waterline. Then he heard it. At first it was barely audible over the roaring surf and screaming wind, a dull, repetitive knock like wood striking stone. Jack paused, straining to locate it. It came again and again. Not mechanical, not natural, rhythmic, desperate. He veered toward the beach, instincts taking over. The sand was slick, turning each step into a fight. The beam of his flashlight jittered through the darkness, sweeping over seaweed, driftwood, broken lobster traps until it caught something that didn't belong. A figure slumped, clinging to a half-submerged plank, like it was a lifeline. Jack's heart jolted. He ran. The closer he got, the clearer it became. This was no corpse. It was a woman young, her arms wrapped so tightly around the driftwood, he had to pry her fingers loose. Her soaked hair stuck to her face in clumps. Blood trickled from a cut above her eyebrow. Her lips were tinged blue. She trembled uncontrollably, her eyes fluttering, but not focusing. "Hey," Jack shouted, crouching beside her. "Can you hear me?" She moaned softly, a wordless sound, and then whispered something that vanished in the wind. Her body sagged into his arms without thinking. Jack scooped her up. She was cold, bone cold and frighteningly light. He cradled her close, shielding her from the rain with his own body as he half-carried, half-stumbled back toward the boathouse. Inside, he laid her on the worn-out cot in the corner, stripped off the wettest layers of her clothing, and piled every blanket he could find over her shivering frame. He lit the fire, cursing the wet logs, then turned on a portable heater he'd nearly forgotten he owned. Her teeth chattered, eyes shut, breath shallow. "Come on," he murmured, kneeling beside her. "Don't give up now. You made it through the storm, with no cell service and no landline. Calling for help was out of the question." The road to town would be washed out for hours, maybe longer. So Jack did the only thing he could. He stayed. He rubbed warmth back into her fingers, refilled the fire, whispered reassurances she couldn't hear. And as he sat by her side, watching the rise and fall of her chest, something long dormant stirred in him. Not grief, not guilt, but something quieter. Hope. By dawn, the storm had passed. The ocean was quieter now, its surface bruised but calm, like a child who'd cried itself to sleep. Sunlight spilled weakly through the cracks in the boathouse walls. Jack brewed coffee and stared at her from across the room. Her skin had more color now. The shivering had stopped, And then suddenly her eyes opened. They were hazel-wide, confused, and filled with something just shy of terror. She sat up too quickly, gasped, and clutched the blanket around her like armor. Where am I? Jack stood slowly, palms open. Easy. You're safe. My name's Jack. You washed up on the rocks outside during the storm. I brought you in. Her gaze darted around the room. To the cot, the fireplace, the tools. Him, she touched her forehead and winced. I don't remember. Your name, Jack asked gently. She shook her head. Anything I don't know who I am. Jack's chest tightened. He'd seen something like this once before, in the service trauma so deep it shut the mind down to protect itself. But seeing it in real life in someone so fragile and lost was something else entirely. That's all right, he said, kneeling beside her. You don't need to remember everything right now. She looked at him like she didn't believe him. Like part of her knew that whatever was waiting in her memories wasn't kind. Jack stood and glanced at the piece of driftwood she'd arrived with now, propped against the doorframe like a relic. Until we figure out who you are, mind if I call you something? She hesitated, then gave a tiny shrug. How about hope? Her eyes flicked to the window where the gray sea stretched endless and unknown hope. She said softly, That feels right. Jack nodded. Then it settled. He poured her a cup of coffee, hands steady for the first time in years. Whatever storm had brought her here, whatever past she'd left behind, this was where the story began. And Jack, for the first time in a decade, didn't mind being a part of it. The name Hope lingered in the air like salt spray on morning wind. She sat on the edge of the cot, wrapped in Jack's old flannel shirt, her bare feet tucked beneath the thick quilt. Her wet clothes hung by the fire to dry the salt crusted along their seams, giving them the scent of seaweed and survival. Jack moved quietly in the background, preparing oatmeal with honey and dried cranberries, the best he could offer on short notice. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. Hope stared at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. She flexed her fingers, traced the lines of her palms as if some memory might rise up through her skin. But nothing came. Not her name, not her age, not why she'd been floating alone in the Pacific Ocean, clinging to driftwood in the middle of a storm. I thought maybe the smell of food might help, Jack said, setting a steaming bowl beside her on the old oak table. His voice was soft, careful not to spook her. Hunger's a language the body remembers. She looked up hesitant. Thank you again. You're welcome again. He gave a small smile, then turned back toward the sink, giving her space. Hope took a tentative bite. The warmth spread through her, gentle and grounding. It reminded her of something home, maybe, but the moment passed before she could catch it. I don't even know if I like oatmeal, she said quietly, almost to herself. Jack glanced over. If it helps you look like someone who might. A shadow of a smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. He let her eat in silence, just as he'd once let his daughter do when she was frightened after a nightmare. You didn't rush the healing. You sat with it. You waited. And eventually it told you what it needed. When Hope finished, she set the spoon down with deliberate care. I should be in a hospital, she murmured. You should, Jack agreed, but the storm knocked out the roads and phones. We're cut off until the utility crews make it out. Maybe another day or two. She nodded slowly, though a flicker of unease crossed her face. That piece of wood, the one I was holding, do you still have it? Jack pointed to the driftwood now resting near the door, damp and weathered but intact. She stood and walked over, wrapping her fingers around it. I don't know why I held on so tightly, she whispered. It wasn't just to stay afloat. It felt familiar, like something I had to bring with me. Sometimes the body remembers what the mind can't, Jack said. Hope looked at him, really looked for the first time. The stubble on his jaw, the flecks of gray in his hair, the quiet steadiness in his eyes. She felt safer around him than made any logical sense. But then nothing about her life in the past 24 hours had followed logic. Why were you out in the storm? She asked suddenly. Jack paused before answering. The generator went out. I went to fix it. Heard something knocking against the rocks, found you. She swallowed. If you hadn't, well, he said, folding his arms, we don't have to finish that sentence. He nodded toward a coat draped over a chair. If you're up for a walk, there's a bluff just behind the boathouse. It's where the sun shows up first when it decides to. Might help you think. Hope hesitated, then nodded. The motion felt right, like movement might wake something inside her. She stepped into the boots Jack offered. They were too big but warm, and followed him out into the early morning chill. The world was quiet in the way only post-storm mornings are. The earth freshly rinsed, the sky still uncertain. They climbed a short dirt path that wound through wild grass and wind-bent trees. At the top of the bluff, the view opened like a curtain, endless sea stretching west, cliffs falling away to frothy waves, seagulls wheeling in the salt air. Hope stared out, her arms folded tight across her chest. "It's beautiful," she said almost reluctantly. "Terrifying, too." Jack nodded. "The ocean's never just one thing." She took a slow breath. "Do you think I fell off a boat?" "Could be," he replied. "That piece of wood looked like it came from a yacht or something fancy, not your average fishing vessel." "I have this feeling," she said, her voice unsteady, "that someone's looking for me. Or maybe that someone wanted me to disappear." Jack turned to her. "You think someone tried to hurt you?" "I don't know. It's just, I keep seeing flashes. Lights, music, a hand on my shoulder, then water so cold." She wrapped her arms tighter around herself, her jaw trembling. Jack didn't ask more. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Not to fix, not to press, just to say, "I'm here." They stood in silence for a while, letting the wind pass through them. Hope felt something begin to crack open inside her. Not memory, not yet, but presence. She was here. She was breathing. She wasn't alone. As they walked back to the boathouse, Hope asked, "Why did you name me Hope?" Jack considered this for a long moment before answering. "Because that's what I felt when I found you. And that's not something I've felt in a very long time." Hope didn't reply, but when they reached the steps, she paused and looked at the sea one last time. A question hovered behind her lips, unformed. She didn't know who she was or where she belonged, but this man, this place, this strange, fragile connection. It felt like the first thread in something she didn't yet understand. Maybe she didn't need all the answers right away. Maybe for now, being called Hope was enough. Hope woke to the smell of cedar smoke and salt air. It had been nearly 48 hours since Jack found her on the shoreline, and while her body was beginning to mend, her mind still felt like a shattered mirror. Memories came in fragments, a flash of champagne glasses, the hum of engines, the sting of sea spray, but nothing held long enough to grasp. Still, she was alive, breathing awake. And in a place that strangely didn't frighten her, she pushed the quilt aside and rose from the cot. The room was quiet, sun filtering through the wood-slatted windows in golden stripes. She could hear gulls outside, the distant crash of waves, and a rhythmic tap tools, perhaps from somewhere nearby. She walked barefoot across the cool floorboards and found Jack outside, crouched beside an overturned rowboat. He didn't look up right away, focused on sanding down the keel. His movements were calm, methodical, the kind of quiet work that speaks to a man who's made peace with solitude. "Morning," she said gently. He looked up, shielding his eyes from the sun. "You slept late." "I feel like I haven't slept for days," she admitted. "But thank you for everything. I don't know how many times I've said that, but—" "You can keep saying it," Jack said with a shrug. "I don't mind." She smiled and walked a little closer. "What are you working on?" "Just fixing a crack in the hull," he replied. "One of the local boys took this thing out in rough water last week, came back half drowned and missing an oar." She reached out, running her fingers along the smooth edge of the boat. "You work with your hands a lot." "It's the only thing I trust these days," Jack replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "Wood's honest. If it breaks, it shows you where people—" Not so much. There was no bitterness in his voice, just honesty, the kind that made you stop and listen. "I'd like to help," Hope said suddenly. He blinked. "Help, I don't know who I am or what I'm supposed to be doing, but I know I can't just sit around waiting for answers to drop from the sky. Let me help, even if I'm terrible at it." He studied her for a moment, then handed her a sanding block. "Start here," he said, pointing to the worn side of the boat. "With the grain not against it." She nodded and got to work. They spent the rest of the morning in companionable silence. Jack showed her how to seal a seam with resin, how to check for waterlogging, How to tell when a plank had one more season in it. Hope caught on quickly, and while her hands fumbled at first, there was a steadiness in her determination that Jack couldn't help but admire. When the sun reached its peak, they took a break. Jack handed her a thermos of water and a peanut butter sandwich, and they sat on an overturned crate near the boathouse, watching the waves roll in. "Do you remember anything new?" he asked gently. Hope shook her head. "Only flashes, a silver watch, a song playing on the radio, a man's voice saying my name. But not Hope. Something else. But I can't make it out, that'll come." Jack said brains are stubborn, but they're not permanent vaults. Sooner or later, something will click. She looked out at the horizon. "Do you ever wish you could forget?" Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow sip from his mug. "Some days, yeah," he said finally. "But forgetting means losing the good with the bad. And I've got some good I want to hang on to." Hope glanced at him, sensing a story behind those words, but chose not to press. In the afternoon, they walked along the beach. Jack pointed out seabird nests tucked high into the cliffs, and the smooth stones locals swore brought luck. Hope picked one up, a pale gray oval, with a thin white stripe, and slipped it into her pocket without knowing why. At one point she stopped and looked out over the water, her breath catching. "What is it?" Jack asked. "I think I was on a boat," she said slowly. "Something big, not a fishing boat, sleek, expensive. There were lights, music, people laughing, and then—" her voice faltered, her arms wrapped around herself instinctively. "And then I fell," she whispered. "Or I was pushed." Jack felt a cold ripple pass through him. He stepped closer, his voice steady. "You're safe now. Whatever happened, you survived it. But I don't know what I'm going back to," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "What if it's worse than being lost?" Jack wanted to offer reassurance, a tidy answer, a promise that it would all work out. But he knew better than to lie. The truth was, sometimes the past hurt more than the unknown. "I don't know what's waiting for you," he said, "but you don't have to face it alone." Hope looked at him, then really looked, and something in her softened. They walked the rest of the way in silence. When they reached the boathouse, Hope paused on the steps. "Would it be all right," she asked, "if I stayed a little longer? Just until I figure out what to do next." Jack nodded. "You're welcome here, Hope, for as long as you need." That night she helped him cook a simple dinner soup and biscuits from scratch. They listened to the fire crackle and the sea breathe in the distance. And though the wind had stilled, something else stirred in the air between them, fragile, cautious, but unmistakably alive. They were two people shaped by loss, caught between past and future, holding quietly to the present like driftwood in a vast and shifting sea. And for the first time, Hope didn't feel like a stranger in her own skin. She felt, almost found. It started with a sound, a thump, distant hollow. Echoing from the harbor docks like an old drum waking from slumber, Hope looked up from the boat she was sanding and froze. Jack bent over a toolbox nearby, didn't notice her change in posture right away. But when she straightened abruptly and took a step back, he stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Something wrong," she didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the water beyond the boathouse to the end of the dock, where a sleek white yacht was mooring, modern, expensive, foreign, to this quiet working-class town. Hope's chest rose and fell rapidly. "I know that boat," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Jack followed her gaze. The yacht was a floating mansion, glistening chrome-tinted windows, crew in uniform. It looked absurd, docked among the lobster trawlers and dinged-up crab boats of the locals. Hope clutched her hands to her chest. "I've seen it before I was on it. The night of the storm." "You're sure?" Jack asked gently. "I remember lights," she said, eyes narrowing. "Music. There were string lights strung across the deck. And a piano. Someone was playing piano." Then just as quickly she recoiled. "Someone grabbed me." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Jack stepped forward instinctively. "Hey," he said softly. "It's okay. You're safe now." "No, you don't understand," she said, backing toward the boathouse wall. "I wasn't supposed to fall overboard. Someone pushed me." The silence that followed felt thick, oppressive. Jack ran a hand through his hair. "Do you remember who?" She pressed her eyes shut, shaking her head. "No. Just a hand on my back, firm, deliberate. and then I was in the water choking. The room held still for a moment. Outside, the wind changed, carrying the scent of oil and salt, and something sharper uneased. Jack reached for the kettle on the stovetop and poured 2 mugs of tea. His mind was turning over possibilities like driftwood in a tide. A yacht like that belonged to money. Big money. Maybe someone who didn't want her back? "Do you think someone meant to kill you?" he asked quietly. Hope looked at him, eyes wide and wet. "I don't know. But it wasn't an accident." She took the mug from his hands, fingers trembling. "What if someone's still looking for me?" Jack considered this, then walked over to the small desk in the corner and opened his laptop. Miraculously, the storm hadn't fried the signal entirely. He connected to the patchy Wi-Fi and opened a browser. "If you were on that kind of boat," he said, "then someone must have noticed you were missing. Let's check the news." It took less than 5 minutes. The headline hit like a wave: "Missing Heiress, Margot Whitestone, presumed dead in yacht accident." Hope stared at the screen, her breath caught in her throat. The photo showed her hair neatly done, pearl earrings, standing beside a tall man in a tuxedo. Her smile in the photo was tight, formal, empty. She read the caption aloud, her voice hollow. "Margot Whitestone, 29, daughter of shipping tycoon." Alexander Whitestone vanished during a private party aboard the Maribel. A foul play is suspected, though no charges have been filed. Her fiancé, Victor Langley, has offered a $1 million reward for information. Margot, the name dropped into her chest like a stone. "That's me," she said. "I'm Margot Whitestone." Jack leaned back, arms folded, studying her face. The woman on the screen looked polished, controlled. The woman standing in front of him looked reborn. "Do you remember any of it clearly now?" "Hope no." Margot nodded slowly. "It's all blurry, but yes. My father is Alexander Whitestone. We were on the yacht to celebrate my engagement. Victor planned it all." Her voice turned hard. "He always wanted to impress my father." Jack watched her. "Did you want to marry him?" She shook her head. "No, I felt trapped. Victor was charming in public, controlling in private. I was going to end it that night." She turned from the screen, eyes burning. "I confronted him about a company deal, something shady. I found out he was using my name to transfer assets, offshore accounts, fraud. He told me to forget it." Jack's stomach turned. "And when you didn't, I went outside for air. That's when it happened." The push, the fall. The cold. Jack felt anger rise in his chest, not loud or explosive, but steady deep. The idea that someone had tried to erase this woman like a number on a ledger enraged him. "They think I'm dead," she said, her tone flat with realization, "which means I have a choice. I can stay gone, or I can go back." Jack said nothing for a moment. "Either way," he said, "you deserve the truth and you deserve justice." Margot looked out the window toward the yacht now docked in her old world. She no longer felt like she belonged to it. That woman in pearls felt like a ghost. She turned back to Jack. "What would you do if you were me?" Jack hesitated, then answered simply, "I'd make damn sure they knew I survived." She took a long breath, eyes scanning the room. The worn wooden walls, the fire, the scattered tools, the mug in her hand. Then her gaze settled on him. "Would you help me?" Jack met her eyes steady. "You don't even have to ask." And in that moment, something shifted. The tide in her soul began to turn. She wasn't Hope anymore. She wasn't just Margot Whitestone either. She was both, and she was just beginning to understand the power in that. The boathouse, once a quiet cocoon nestled between sea and sky, now held a different kind of silence. The charged, waiting kind. Margot sat at the edge of the dock, legs dangling over the weathered planks, her hair blowing in the breeze as she stared at the luxury yacht still moored in the harbor. Just yesterday, that vessel had been a blurry piece of her broken memory. Now it stood like a monolith from a life she barely recognized. She clenched her fists in her lap. "I should go down there," she muttered. Jack, who stood just a few feet behind her, with crossed arms and a cautious eye on the yacht, didn't answer immediately. He knew that look in her eyes, the one soldiers wore just before they walked into fire. "Go down there and say what exactly?" he asked calmly. "I don't know," she said, frustrated. "Maybe nothing. Maybe just to see if he's there." Jack's jaw tightened. If Victor Langley's on that yacht, then walking down that dock could be dangerous. Margot turned to him. "I'm not afraid of him." "You should be." The man tried to kill you. Margot, that doesn't just go away. She flinched a little at the use of her real name. Still unfamiliar, still sharp. She'd grown used to being hope to the safety that came with not knowing, but she couldn't pretend anymore. She couldn't hide in borrowed names and flannel shirts. I need answers, she said, and I can't get them standing here. Jack studied her face for a long moment. Her features had changed in the short time he'd known her, not physically, but in presence. She was stronger now, more focused, but there was also an edge to her, the brittle kind that comes from realizing someone had once decided your life was disposable. You won't go alone, Jack said finally. If you insist on facing him, I'll be there. A brief silence passed between them, then Margot nodded once. They waited until dusk. The marina had quieted, and the tourists had trickled off into town for dinner. Jack pulled an old navy peacoat over his shoulders, while Margot, now in a simple black sweater and jeans borrowed from one of Jack's storage bins, tied her hair back and pocketed the lucky stone she'd found on the beach for strength. They approached the yacht as the lights flicked on across its decks. It looked exactly like she remembered: polished rails, white leather cushions, and the faint hum of music behind tinted glass. The name Maribel gleamed in gold across the stern. A crew member in a white polo shirt looked up as they neared. "Can I help you?" he asked. Margot stepped forward. Her voice, to her own surprise, was steady. "I'm looking for Victor Langley." The man narrowed his eyes clearly, scanning her face. His expression faltered. "One moment," he said, turning toward the interior. Jack moved closer, his body angled slightly in front of her. "You sure about this?" "No," she admitted, "but it's time." Footsteps returned faster this time, and then he appeared. Victor. He stepped onto the deck with the air of a man who thought every room belonged to him. Tall, tan, immaculately groomed, his linen shirt unbuttoned just enough to suggest wealth without effort. He froze when he saw her. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then his jaw twitched. "Margot." She stood taller. "Hello, Victor." His eyes darted toward Jack, then back to her. "But how they said you were dead," she said coldly. "I was to you, at least." He took a cautious step forward. "Margot, I thought you drowned. I called the Coast Guard. I don't lie to me." Her voice cracked like ice. "I remember Victor. Not everything, but enough. The confrontation, the threats. The moment I turned my back," Victor's eyes flicked to the crew member still hovering nearby. "This isn't the place," he said. "Let's go inside. Talk privately." "I'm not here to talk privately," she said. "I'm here to tell you. I remember what you did, and I'm not going away." Jack's presence behind her was quiet but firm. Victor glanced at him again, reading the threat in Jack's posture. "You don't have proof." Victor hissed the mask, slipping just enough to show the man underneath. "No one will believe you're wrong," Margot cut in. "Because this time, I'm not alone." She pulled out a flash drive from her pocket, the one Jack had helped her load earlier, with screenshots of financial transfers she had remembered and searched for. Not everything, but enough. And more importantly, she had a voice now, and she was going to use it. Victor's face paled, but he quickly forced a smile. "We can make this go away. Name your price." Margot's hand shook as she stepped closer. "You already tried to make me go away. This time I decide what happens." Jack stepped forward, his voice low. "You should get off this boat, Mr. Langley. Before you say something else you can't take back." Victor sneered, but took the hint. He retreated inside without another word. Margot turned, legs weak, breath shaky. Jack steadied her with a hand on her back. "You okay?" "No," she whispered, "but I'm glad I did it." They walked back in silence, the stars beginning to prick the sky above them. The tide was rising slow, steady, unstoppable. That night, Margot stood by the fire, her shoulders wrapped in one of Jack's blankets. She watched the flames flicker, her mind turning over everything she had said and everything still left unsaid. "I thought seeing him would make me feel powerful," she murmured. "But mostly I just feel..." "Tired," Jack nodded. "That's normal. It takes a lot of strength to survive someone who tried to erase you." "I think I'm starting to remember who I was," she said, "but I'm not sure I want to be her anymore." Jack looked up. "Then don't be someone else. Be someone new." She turned toward him, her expression soft. "Hope." His smile was quiet. She's not such a bad person to be. Margot walked to the window staring out at the sea. I'm going to disappear again, she said. But this time it'll be my choice. And I'll come back when I'm ready. Not just to fight, but to live. Jack said nothing, but in his silence there was agreement. Trust, something deeper than words. The heiress the world had lost was no longer missing. She had chosen instead to begin again. The next morning broke quietly without ceremony. A soft marine layer drifted in from the coast, folding over the cliffs like a shroud, turning the world muted and gray. Jack stood at the kitchen counter pouring coffee, his every motion unhurried as if he were trying to delay the weight of what this day might bring. Across the room, Margot sat with her knees pulled up to her chest on the faded leather couch, staring at the flash drive resting on the coffee table. The faint hum of the laptop beside it filled the silence like an anxious breath. I had forgotten about this part, she said softly, her eyes distant. The part where I have to look, Jack glanced over. You don't have to. Not if you're not ready, I'm not ready, she said. But I have to do it anyway. He didn't press. He simply sat beside her, letting the moment settle between them. Margot reached for the drive and slid it into the laptop's USB port. The folder opened. Inside were bank records, email threads, and transaction reports that until recently had been no more than static in her memory. But now they had shape, names, figures, signatures. Her own forged, the details came flooding back like a slow-breached dam. Victor had been more than manipulative. He had been deliberate calculating. He had gotten close to her father not just through charm, but through mutual interest concealing overseas deals that skirted legality and shielded assets from federal oversight. Margot had stumbled upon one such transaction weeks before the engagement party, a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands tied to a freight line that didn't actually exist. She had confronted Victor. He had smiled and told her it wasn't her concern. But then when she threatened to go to her father, everything shifted. You're being emotional. Margot, he'd said, you don't understand how the world works. But she had understood enough to back up the documents and send a copy to herself. A copy she never received because 2 days later, her email was wiped. Her phone disappeared and she was boarding the Maribel. This wasn't about me getting cold feet, Margot whispered. He knew I could ruin everything. Jack leaned forward, scanning the files over her shoulder. And your father, do you think he knew what Victor was doing? Margot hesitated. The idea that her father, a man she had spent her entire life trying to make proud, might have looked the other way, was harder to stomach than the betrayal of a fiancé. My father doesn't deal in gray areas, she said bitterly. Only in bottom lines, Jack's brow furrowed. So either he was complicit, or he saw you as a liability. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The implication hung heavy. God, she muttered, running her hands through her hair. It's all dirt and dollars. Every part of my life. The parties, the philanthropy, the magazine covers, just set dressing. She stood and began pacing, the words tumbling out faster now. I used to think I was one of the good ones, that I could take my father's company and do something real with it. Clean it up, make it better. But now I think he never intended to let me near it. I was just a name. A PR boost, a ribbon on the box. Jack watched her quietly, waiting for the storm to crest. I think she continued, voice low. I was never supposed to leave that boat. Her words were almost too soft to hear, but they cut through him like wind over steel. Jack stood and took a step closer. You're here now. That's what matters. She turned to him, eyes brimming but defiant. Then I need to decide what I'm going to do with that fact. I can't go back to being Margot Whitestone. Not the way they expect. I can't step into a boardroom and smile for cameras like none of this happened. You don't have to, Jack said. You can expose them. Tell your story. She looked at him, 100 emotions playing across her face. But if I do, it won't just ruin Victor. It could destroy my father. His empire, everything. Jack's voice was steady. So you have to choose between protecting the empire or protecting the truth. Margot sank back onto the couch, pressing her palms to her eyes. I don't know if I'm strong enough to do this. Jack knelt in front of her, his voice low and earnest. You already did the hard part. You survived. Now you decide what you want to live for. They sat that way for a long time. Later that afternoon, Jack drove them into town. It was Margot's first real trip outside since the storm. She wore sunglasses and a ball cap to stay anonymous. though few people in the sleepy coastal town would recognize a woman from glossy magazines. They stopped at a small print shop run by one of Jack's old Navy buddies, where she scanned and printed select files from the flash drive. From there, they mailed an envelope unmarked no return address to a journalist. Jack trusted in Portland, a man who'd once reported on a corrupt fishing conglomerate and paid the price with his job. Margot watched the envelope disappear into the slot, her hands shaking. "There's no taking this back," she whispered. "Then don't look back," Jack said. They sat at a quiet bench near the harbor afterward, watching the boats sway in their slips. The Maribel had already gone. Victor had likely received the message loud and clear. "Do you think they'll come after me?" she asked. Jack didn't answer right away. "They'll try," he said finally, "but you're not who you were." She glanced sideways at him. "And who am I now?" He met her eyes, calm and certain. "Someone the world underestimated, and someone they're going to regret crossing." Margot looked back out at the water. It was calmer today, less threatening, more alive. The same sea that had nearly claimed her had returned her with purpose. For so long she'd been defined by legacy, by wealth, by other people's decisions. But now for the first time she was building something of her own. Not a fortune, but a voice. A truth they had tried to bury. But she was still here, and she would not stay silent. The fog that had blanketed the coast all morning began to lift by late afternoon, revealing a sun-soaked harbor and boats glistening like small monuments on glassy water. Jack and Margot walked in silence back toward the boathouse, a crisp breeze tugging at the hem of her borrowed sweater. The envelope had been mailed, the truth set loose, and now there was nothing to do but wait. Margot had imagined feeling triumphant, maybe even free, but instead an ache had settled deep inside her chest. A quiet knowing that something was ending, and whatever came next wouldn't be simple. Inside the boathouse she paced. "You ever feel like you're standing in the middle of a bridge?" she asked suddenly, not sure which way to go. "Like you don't quite belong on either side." Jack looked up from where he sat, sharpening a chisel on the workbench. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he set the tool down and wiped his hands on a rag. "Yeah," he said. "More times than I'd like to admit." Margot leaned against the frame of the open doorway. The sea stretched beyond them as calm as it had been chaotic days before. But the storm inside her still churned. "There's a part of me that wants to disappear completely," she said. "Just vanish. Leave the Whitestone name behind. Let them clean up their own mess. I could start over somewhere quiet. Maybe even stay here." Jack met her eyes but said nothing. His silence wasn't cold. It was spacious, the kind that allowed her words to settle and echo. "But then I think," she continued, "if I run, they win. And worse, I'll never stop wondering if I could have done more. Exposed more. Helped someone else not fall into the same trap." Jack stood crossing the room to stand beside her. "You've already done more than most people in your position ever would," he said. "But this isn't about just doing more. It's about asking what you want for your life." She looked at him, almost vulnerable. "That's the problem. I don't know what I want." "Not yet," Jack nodded. "Then don't rush the answer." They stood quietly at the threshold for a moment longer before Margot turned away and wandered toward the old bench beneath the cedar tree near the bluff. Jack stayed back, watching her silhouette against the pale horizon. She moved with a kind of tension, the weight of someone who'd carried more than her share, yet wasn't quite ready to set it down. She sat there for nearly an hour. When she finally came back inside, the shadows had begun to lengthen, and Jack was boiling water for tea. She dropped a folded piece of paper on the table between them. "What's this?" he asked. "My name. My full one, social security number, a few contacts in case something happens to me." Jack's jaw tensed. "That's not going to happen." "No," she said. "It probably won't, but if it does, I want someone I trust to know who I am." He stared at the paper, then at her. "Why me? Because you don't want anything from me." The words landed like a stone in a still pond. Jack didn't respond right away. When he finally did, his voice was low. "Everyone wants something from someone. Margot, even me." She raised a brow. "Oh, and what is it you want?" He hesitated, searching her face. "I want you to know that you deserve better than people who use you. I want you to know you can stay here if you want to." That you don't owe the world a performance just because it's watching. Something flickered in her eyes, not tears but the recognition of truth, pure and hard and strangely gentle. She sat down at the table across from him. You've been honest with me since the beginning. Even when it hurt, I figured you'd had enough lies to last a lifetime, he said. A small smile tugged at her mouth. Yeah, I have. They drank their tea in silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. Just as the sun began to dip, casting long streaks of gold across the windows, Jack rose and pulled something from the top drawer of the workbench. A small carved boat, no more than 6 inches long. I made this a few years ago, he said, placing it gently in her hands. Used to think I'd toss it out when I got tired of looking at it, but I couldn't. Margot studied it, the delicate craftsmanship, the smooth curve of the hull, the care in every detail. It's beautiful, she said, brushing her fingers over it. I started building it after the accident, Jack said. After my wife and daughter were lost, I didn't know what else to do with my hands. Couldn't fix what was broken. So I just kept shaping wood. Margot looked up at him, the edges of her eyes soft. I'm sorry, she said, for what you lost. He nodded, accepting the words. Some losses never go away. You just learn to carry them differently. She held the boat to her chest for a moment, then set it gently back on the table. I think I understand now, she said. I've been trying to figure out who I'm supposed to be. Margot hoped the heiress, the girl who vanished, but none of those are the full story. She paused, her voice steady. Maybe I don't have to be just one thing. Jack's eyes met hers. No one ever does. That night, Margot sat at the old desk with a pen and a blank notebook. She wrote for hours, not emails, not legal statements, but something quieter, something more honest. Letters to her father, to the press, to the lawyer she trusted once, but also to herself. By the time she looked up, Jack had fallen asleep in the chair by the fire, book in hand. She studied him for a long moment. His face was softened by sleep, a man who had known pain but carried it without bitterness. She thought about what he said about not rushing the answer, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe that maybe she didn't need to choose just yet. Maybe the bridge between two worlds wasn't a place to escape from, but the exact place she needed to be. Not lost, just in between. And maybe she wasn't alone on it. The air carried the scent of pine and brine as the morning sun climbed slowly above the ocean, casting long gold fingers across the boathouse walls. Jack was already awake, whistling softly under his breath as he wiped down his tools and stacked them neatly on the workbench. He'd never been one to make noise in the morning, but today he moved slower than usual, the kind of slow that comes when you know something is about to end. Margot stood outside on the bluff, wrapped in a windbreaker, watching the sea. Her bag, a small canvas duffel borrowed from Jack, sat beside her feet, half zipped. She had packed lightly. A few clothes, the wooden boat Jack had given her, a journal, and the USB drive. Just enough to say she'd been here. Just enough to remember. She didn't say anything when Jack stepped up behind her. She just tilted her head slightly toward the sound of his footsteps. I thought I'd be gone before you were up, she said quietly. I'm an early riser, he replied. Old habits. They stood together shoulder to shoulder, staring at the water that had once separated their worlds and now bound them together. Are you sure about this? Jack asked. Margot nodded. I need to go back. Not to stay. Not yet, but I need to close the door properly. You don't owe them anything. I don't, she agreed. But I owe myself the chance to look them in the eye and walk away on my own terms. Jack took that in without argument. He had known she would leave from the moment she remembered who she was. It had only ever been a matter of when, but that didn't make it easier. There's a train from Newport, he said. Runs twice a day. One leaves at noon. I'll be on it. The silence between them now was different, not heavy with things unsaid, but tender with everything already shared. She turned to face him. Jack, I don't know how to thank you. You already have, he said. You're alive. She smiled softly. I meant it the night I said I might disappear again, but this time I'm not disappearing. I'm just stepping out of the frame for a little while. I'll still be here. Jack said, his voice even. This place doesn't move much, I know. They walked back to the boathouse. She picked up her bag and slung it over her shoulder, Jack handed her a travel mug of coffee, strong and black, just how she'd come to prefer it. At the door she paused, then stepped back inside. Her gaze swept the room, the firewood stacked neatly by the stove, the cot she'd first woken up on, the oil lamp still hanging from the beam, and finally the table where she'd written her first letter to the father, who still hadn't called. "I don't know who I'll be when I come back," she said. Jack looked at her with something close to affection, but gentler, quieter. "You'll be whoever you choose to be. That's enough." She stepped closer and placed a hand on his chest, not romantic, but grounding, like anchoring herself to someone real, before she faced what was next. "I've never had anyone who saw me without asking for something in return," she whispered. "You do now." She nodded, once turned, and walked to the truck. The ride to town was mostly quiet. Jack drove without the radio on hands, steady on the wheel, while Margot watched the coastline blur past the window. The fog had lifted completely by now, revealing every cracked rock, every sun-bleached tree, every wave folding against the shore. She memorized it all. At the station, Jack parked in the gravel lot. They stepped out the train already, a faint rumble in the distance. Margot turned to him one last time. "You'll know if I'm all right, I'll know," Jack said, "because you're strong enough to make it so." She took a deep breath and nodded. Then she leaned in and wrapped her arms around him. Jack didn't flinch, didn't stiffen. He returned the embrace fully protectively, like a harbor closing around a boat that had weathered the worst of the storm. She pulled back. "Goodbye, Jack." He nodded, "Until soon." She boarded the train. Through the window, Jack watched her take her seat, the duffel at her feet, the coffee in her hands. For a brief moment, their eyes met again through the glass. No wave, no final word, just a look. Then the train pulled away and Margot Hope was gone. That evening, Jack sat on the porch, a glass of bourbon in his hand, and the wind tousling his hair. He looked out over the ocean, now quiet, almost still, and thought of her. He didn't know where she would go first. To a lawyer, to her father, to the press, it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had walked back into that world on her own feet. He picked up the small carved boat from the table and turned it in his hands. She had left it behind intentionally with a note folded beneath it. "This helped me find my way. Keep it for me, I'll come back for it, and for the person I was when I met you." Jack smiled, not a big smile, just a quiet one, the kind that stays long after it fades. The fog would roll in again tomorrow. The sea would stir. The tools would hum back to life in his hands, but something had changed, something deep and permanent. He had not saved her. She had saved herself. But in doing so, she had reminded him of something he had long forgotten, that hope could be found even in the darkest water, and that sometimes it washed ashore when you least expected it. It took less than 48 hours for Margot's return to explode across the news. The moment she stepped through the rotating glass doors of the downtown Portland law firm, the same firm that had handled her family's business for over 2 decades, a junior associate recognized her. By the time she left the building, flanked by a legal aide and clutching a thick folder of statements, the headlines had already begun to roll out like waves crashing in sequence. "Missing Heiress returns from the dead. Margot Whitestone speaks betrayal, survival, and a fight for the truth. Victor Langley under federal investigation. After explosive evidence surfaces." Margot didn't speak to reporters that first day. She let the paper trail speak for itself. Bank records, digital backups of the forged signatures, and her handwritten testimony filed with the district attorney. She gave the facts, not drama. She wanted to be heard, not pitied, understated, precise, and deliberate, like a scalpel. But that didn't stop the media from spinning its own versions. There were segments about her miraculous survival, flashy reenactments of the night she vanished, panel discussions on television, dissecting her relationship with Victor Langley. They pulled old photos of her at charity galas, sound bites from board meetings and interviews she'd given as a 20-something, trying to prove she was more than her father's shadow. She watched it all from a hotel room she'd booked under a pseudonym. The Margot on the screen looked polished, flawless, a mask made of bone-white smiles and carefully chosen words. The woman sitting in bed with her knees drawn up and dark circles under her eyes didn't recognize her. A knock at the door startled her. Her lawyer, Rebecca Sloan, stood on the other side holding a copy of the New York Times and a tablet blinking with notifications. You're going viral, Rebecca said dryly, setting both down on the table. Great, Margot muttered. Every survivor's dream. Rebecca sat across from her, folding her legs like someone about to give bad news gently. They're going to subpoena Victor officially, she said. But your father is harder. Margot's fingers stiffened around her mug. He knew Rebecca hesitated. We can't prove direct knowledge, but he signed off on some of the deals Victor used as cover. Offshore transfers, asset shielding. If he didn't know he should have, that's negligence at best. Willful blindness at worst. Margot didn't speak. There's more, Rebecca added. He released a statement. She slid the tablet across the table. Margot tapped the screen. A pre-recorded video played her father, Alexander Whitestone, seated behind the mahogany desk in his Manhattan office flanked by the company's insignia. He looked older, paler, but still formidable. My daughter Margot's return is a blessing beyond words. We are grateful she is alive and safe. Any allegations of misconduct involving Mr. Langley or the Whitestone Corporation will be handled through proper legal channels. In the meantime, I ask that the public respect our family's privacy as we reunite and heal. He didn't mention her bravery, her ordeal, her evidence. He never even said her name again. Margot shut off the screen. Classic deflection. Rebecca said, he's making it about optics. Keeping the board calm. Margot set the tablet down and stood walking toward the window. Portland stretched out below her, the streets buzzing with mid-morning traffic, people with their own errands, worries, lives. Somewhere out there, someone had just read her name and made a judgment, and someone else had just whispered it with awe. She closed her eyes. I didn't come back for him. Or the company. I know I came back to speak. She said to make sure they didn't erase me. You did, Rebecca said, and you shook the entire house doing it. Later that day, Margot agreed to one interview. One only, not for profit, not for fame. Just to set the record straight on her terms. She chose a quiet podcast hosted by a woman who had built a platform on listening to survivors. No flashing lights, no studio audience, just 2 chairs, 2 voices. When the interview aired, it wasn't her tears that went viral. It was a single sentence. I didn't drown, I was pushed. And I will never let them bury the truth again. Back at the Oregon coast, Jack watched the clip on his laptop in the dim light of the boathouse. The fire crackled behind him, the kettle gently whistling, and Gulliver, the stray cat who had recently adopted him, curled at his feet. He hadn't turned on the television in years, but for this he made an exception. There she was, poised, candid, clear-eyed, still Margot. But something more. The woman he had found clinging to driftwood wasn't lost anymore. She was charting her course now. Storm be damned. He smiled softly, took a sip of his tea, and leaned back in his chair. She'd done what she set out to do. Not just survive, but face them, speak truth, rise. She hadn't called yet. He hadn't expected her to. She was in the thick of it now. Lawyers pressed lawsuits, memories sharp as knives. But he kept a little wooden boat on the windowsill just in case. And every now and then, he would look out to the horizon and wonder, not with worry, but with quiet hope, how far she'd come, and when she'd be ready to come home. The first letter came on a Thursday. Jack found it tucked inside his mailbox, nestled between a parts catalog and a community flyer for the local sea festival. No return address, but he knew her handwriting instantly slanted deliberate, like someone who had learned to speak carefully and write with purpose. He opened the envelope with a carpenter's knife and unfolded the page. Dear Jack, I don't know where to begin, so I'll begin with this. I'm okay. Not always okay, not every moment of every day. But I'm standing. I've learned that's a kind of victory too. Everything you said about choosing who I want to be, it's in my bones now. Some mornings I wake up and don't quite know which version of myself I'm stepping into. But the difference is, I'm no longer afraid of either. Victor has been indicted. His lawyers are circling like sharks. But the DA is solid. My testimony, the files, the paper trail, it's all holding. The court date is months away, but they've frozen his accounts. He can't buy his way out this time. As for my father, we spoke once. It was short, hollow. He asked if I'd consider stepping back from the press for the family's image. I told him the family could survive a little public discomfort. Not sure he liked that. But Jack, here's what I really want to tell you. The thing I couldn't say before I left. You reminded me that truth isn't loud. It doesn't always come with sirens or headlines. Sometimes it's the quiet man who carries it, the one who listens instead of speaks. The one who builds things not to show off, but because healing is found in the making. You didn't just save me from the storm. You helped me remember who I am. Until soon, Margot. Jack read it twice, then again once more, before carefully folding it back and tucking it into a wooden cigar box he kept in the drawer beneath the workbench, a place where things worth keeping were laid to rest like sacred relics. He didn't reply. Not yet. But the next week another letter arrived, then another. Each time Margot wrote from somewhere new, a cabin in the Catskills, a retreat in Mendocino, a rented flat in Vermont. She wasn't hiding, she was rebuilding, piecing together a life that was hers, not one crafted for her, by press releases and social expectations. Her words were raw at times, but always luminous, like driftwood, polished by sea and time. In one letter she described planting a garden for the first time. In another she wrote about volunteering at a women's shelter under an alias. Sometimes it's nice to be nobody at all, she'd written. But still myself, Jack responded once after the fourth letter. He kept it short. Dear Margot, the boathouse is quieter without you, but it holds the echo of your footsteps. The gulls still bicker on the roof like old men. The cedar tree is blooming early this year. I'm proud of you. Not for what you did, though, that would be enough, but for the way you did it, with grace, with grit. On your own 2 feet, take your time. No one's rushing the tide. Jai, he didn't know what to expect after that, but her next letter arrived right on time. Dear Jack, you said no one's rushing the tide. That made me smile. I think I've been the tide all my life, rushing in, crashing hard, trying to reshape everything around me. But maybe now, I just want to be the shore. Steady waiting, soft enough to welcome what returns. I'm not there yet, but I think I know the way. Do you still have the little boat, the one you carved? I picture it on your shelf sometimes, right where the light hits in the late afternoon. That's how I imagine you, hands busy thoughts. Quiet, the ocean humming in the distance. I miss the sound of your kettle. I miss the silence between your sentences. I miss you. I'll write again soon. I hope one day I won't have to love me. Jack didn't show the letters to anyone. He didn't need to. They were like offerings, bits of her soul folded between pages, drifting to him across miles in memory. And with everyone he felt something mend in himself too. He hadn't known how much he'd shut away over the years. The grief, the weight, the loneliness that clung like salt to wood. But her letters, they were sunlight on damp beams. They reached places he hadn't touched in a decade. And though she was far away, though there were no promises of return or forever, he felt her with him, in the rustle of the wind through the cedars, in the way the tide curved around the shore now, like it remembered her too. One night Jack walked down to the beach just before sunset. He carried the wooden boat in his hands, the one Margot had left behind. He set it gently into the water, not to send it away, but to see it float. It rocked for a moment, then steadied, catching the current with grace. He smiled. Sometimes he thought it's not about chasing what's gone. Sometimes it's about knowing that when the tide turns, what's meant for you always finds its way back. The early spring sun lingered longer now, casting golden sheets of light across the bluffs behind Jack's boathouse. The days had softened. The wind, while still crisp, no longer bit the skin. Gulls called lazily overhead, swooping in figure eights above the masts in the harbor. And Jack, as he had for years, kept his hands busy. He was refinishing a small canoe that had belonged to a retired fisherman down the coast. The wood had split down the keel, the salt air eating at the seams. But Jack liked boats like this, battered but not broken. They reminded him of people. He was sanding the edge when the engine hum reached him. Not the rattle of a fisherman's truck or the grumble of delivery vans, but something smoother, softer, familiar. He didn't turn around immediately. He didn't need to. Instead, he laid the sanding block down and slowly rose, wiping his hands on a rag heart already tightening in his chest. The car came to a gentle stop outside the boathouse. A door opened, then closed, and then silence. Jack turned. She stood there, hair longer now, darker at the ends, curled slightly by the wind. Her coat flared around her knees, her hands hung loose at her sides, a canvas tote slung over one shoulder. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, no armor. But her eyes, those clear, intelligent eyes, they were unchanged, just steadier now rooted. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. They simply looked at each other for a long moment, as if unsure whether to laugh or cry, or whether they might do both. Then Margot took a step forward. I didn't want to write this. Time, she said softly. I wanted to say it. Jack nodded once the lump rising in his throat preventing words. I'm back, she said. Not because I ran out of places to go, not because I needed a break, but because I've been to the end of the map and this is where the road turns soft again. She looked at the boathouse behind him, the cedar tree swaying in the distance, the porch where they'd once watched the world grow quiet. This is where I want to begin. Really begin. Jack cleared his throat. You sure I'm not sure of anything, she admitted, except that I don't want to do the next chapter without you. He let out a breath, part relief, part surrender. You didn't have to come back, he said. I know, she said. But I wanted to. Jack stepped forward, meeting her halfway. She smiled, a small, real thing, and he reached out, brushing a strand of wind-blown hair from her cheek. His hand lingered for just a moment longer than needed. I kept the boat, he said. Her eyes shimmered. I knew you would. They walked slowly to the bluff where they had stood together all those weeks ago, when she was still hope, and he was still afraid to believe in second chances. Now she reached into her tote and pulled out a journal, the same one she had written in through her travels. She placed it carefully on the bench along with the stone she'd picked up from the beach, the one that had brought her luck. Aren't you going to toss it back into the sea? Jack asked gently. Margot shook her head. No, some things aren't meant to be let go. They're meant to be planted. She looked around. This place, it's seen versions of both of us, the broken ones, the ones who weren't ready. But I think maybe we're ready now. Jack turned to her. What do you see when you look ahead? She paused. A garden, a small workshop, maybe a dog, I don't know. A life one that doesn't feel like a performance. He studied her, then nodded slowly. You don't have to be anyone's legacy here. I know, she said. That's why I came. They stood in silence for a while, watching the tide roll in. Later, back at the boathouse, Margot made tea while Jack lit the fire. It felt natural, as if she'd only stepped away for a long errand, and the rhythm of their life had simply paused in her absence. They didn't talk about court cases or headlines or boardrooms. That part of the world felt far away, and deservedly so. I've thought a lot about what healing means, Margot said as she passed him a mug. Everyone wants it to be this straight line, but I think it's more like stitching a sail, slow, precise. You don't always notice when it's getting stronger, but one day it holds the wind again. Jack smiled. That's a good way to put it. She sat across from him, pulling her knees up beneath her. I used to think I had to rebuild my old life. Prove that I could return to it, shine it up, make it mine. But now, I don't want that life back. I want something that's real, even if it's small, even if it's quiet. He sipped his tea. You sure you're ready for quiet? Margot grinned, as long as it's the kind where the silence says more than words. Jack nodded, something soft unraveling in his chest. He hadn't imagined this future, hadn't dared. But now, as the fire cracked and the steam rose from their mugs, he let himself settle into the peace of it. Not an ending, a return. A new chapter written not with fanfare, but with footsteps back to the place where everything had truly begun, with driftwood and salt, and a woman who had been both lost and found. The woman who had chosen to come home. Spring came gently to the Oregon coast that year. The days stretched longer, and the wind no longer carried a threat, but a promise of warmth, of calm, tides of life returning in small and tender ways. Jack woke early now, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Mornings had become something sacred. Margot humming softly in the kitchen, the smell of coffee, the creak of old wood floors beneath bare feet, the quiet joy of another day beginning with no urgency, no headlines, no masks. She was back not as the woman who had once vanished from the glossy world of luxury yachts and whispered power plays, but as the woman who had chosen healing, simplicity, and truth. The woman who called herself Margot, but still smiled when he slipped and called her Hope. Hope was who I was when I needed saving. She had said one morning, Margot is who I am now because I saved myself. The garden they planted behind the boathouse was small but vibrant. Rows of herbs, tomatoes, sunflowers swaying like dancers in the breeze. Jack had built her raised beds out of driftwood, each board sanded and smoothed, engraved with a quiet line of poetry or memory. She watered them barefoot, laughing when the hose curled like a snake at her feet. Sometimes she'd press seeds into the earth as if planting parts of herself, things she was ready to grow, not bury. One afternoon they walked along the bluff and found the exact place where Jack had first taken her to see the sea, the day she hadn't even known her own name. She stopped there, pulled from her coat a small plaque she'd carved herself, and hammered it gently into the earth. It read, "Here begins again." He hadn't said anything. He'd simply taken her hand, and together they watched the waves roll in and out, a rhythm older than pain, more certain than memory. In town, people began to notice them. The woman with the sharp eyes and soft voice who helped at the library fundraiser. The man who repaired boats with his sleeves rolled up and a silver ring on his finger. Now a simple band Margot had given him, not for ceremony, but for remembrance. "You never asked for me to stay." She'd told him one night, "I didn't want you to feel like you owed me anything." He'd replied she had cupped his face and said, "Then I'm staying because I don't." She never returned to the family mansion in New York. Her father had called twice more, once to make peace, once to offer her a public reconciliation. She'd declined both, but she'd sent him a letter, handwritten and quiet, saying she hoped he found something real in the space where legacy once lived. She never heard back, and that was okay. Some endings didn't need applause, some needed silence. Victor Langley was indicted on multiple charges. The trial made headlines. She testified firm and composed and then walked out of the courtroom and didn't look back. Justice was served, but more importantly, so was closure. She didn't follow the headlines anymore. Instead, she followed the tide. One morning, long after the court cases were behind her and the world had moved on to newer scandals, Margot stood barefoot on the beach, her arms crossed lightly over her chest. The wind tangled her hair. Jack stood beside her, his hand brushing against hers, and for a moment they just watched the horizon together. Out in the water, a small wooden sailboat bobbed gently, the same one they'd restored together over the winter. The mast rose proudly, the sails tucked in for now, the tiller wrapped in braided rope she'd chosen. "We should name her," she said. "You saved her." "You name her," Jack said. Margot smiled and looked down at the carving. Jack had just finished along the edge of the hull, the driftwood grace. She exhaled slowly. "That's perfect. She was broken," he said, "but worth saving." She nodded, her eyes misty like us. Jack helped her step into the boat. They pushed off slowly, quietly, letting the wind catch them just outside the inlet where the sea opened wide and blue. The world felt vast again, not threatening, but full of possibility. They didn't speak much on that first voyage. They didn't need to. Margot let her fingers trail through the water as the boat moved forward. The same sea that had once stolen her name now seemed to return it with every gentle wave. It whispered not of who she had been, but of who she had become. And Jack's steady kind. Jack sat beside her not as a savior or a crutch, but as a companion in the truest sense. Someone who had walked with her out of the dark and never asked to be anything but present. As the shore grew smaller behind them and the wind carried them farther out, Margot closed her eyes and breathed deep. She had been lost. She had been broken. But the tide had brought her back not to the life she had before, but to the life she'd always deserved, a life of truth, of peace, of love, not loud and glittering, but steady as the sea. And so the story ends, not with a rescue, but with a return, not with a storm, but with still water, not with a goodbye, but with a new beginning. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it with someone who might need a little hope today. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story that might just stay with you forever. Thank you so much for watching. We truly appreciate you. See you in the next one.